These unconventional times require unconventional conversations. Listen in as your host, Richard Gordon, engages in one-on-one conversations with numerous leaders, elected officials, politicians, and others to learn what's happening in your state, on the Hill, and across America. Now, here's the host of Unconventional Times, Richard Gordon.
This is Unconventional Times. I am your host, Richard Gordon. Thank you for joining us. You know, the world is on fire, and in many instances, it's the United States that's lighting the match. In the last few weeks, we have seen the U.S. start major fights with its best friends, Denmark, France, NATO, Europe generally, Canada. At the same time, we've used our military might to get rid of a dictator in Venezuela, claiming that he was a drug kingpin. But just a few weeks before that, the United States released a convicted drug pin from U.S. jail, the former president of Honduras. All of this while the war in Ukraine rages on, the Middle East peace plan teeters and remains fragile at its very best. You just got to ask yourself, what is going on? Well, that's the question we're going to ask our guest today. I'm really delighted to have a dear friend join us. Frank Lowenstein will be our guest on Unconventional Times. You know, Frank is a foreign policy expert and has been for a long time. He has more than 15 years of very senior expertise at the most higher levels of government. He was a special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He was a senior advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry. I have to take a moment to brag on him and say that he's also the recipient of an award I know is very prestigious, the Distinguished Service Award by the Department of State, which is the highest civilian award that is given by the United States State Department, which is something really he should be very proud of. He was also the staff director and chief counsel of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You've probably seen him on CNN and BBC and CBC and I don't know, so many other stations. It's a delight. You know, Frank is currently an executive director at AMPCO, which is a global advisory and advocacy firm. Frank, I could go on and on with your resume, but let's get on with this. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Richard. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great. It's wonderful having you on, and I really appreciate it. So welcome to Unconventional Times. Look, before I get into all of this, you know, we have so much to talk about. But before we get there, how'd you get here? Not on my show, but how'd you get into foreign relations? How'd you become an expert in this? How'd this whole thing start for you?
Well, really, Richard, it's all been building to this moment. This is the apex of my career right now, this second. So, well, I really started when I was about 12 years old. I went to South Africa. My father was a diplomat, a congressman from New York, and had been enlisted by the Carter administration and really by the South Africans to try to help facilitate a peaceful transition from white rule Rhodesia to black rule Zimbabwe. And so he took us there for a summer. We lived in South Africa. I met Bishop Tutu and Winnie Mandela and Alan Paton and sort of all the big luminaries there. My dad just sort of trailing us along. I think I broke things at every turn. But in any event, when I left there, I just remember thinking, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to try to be engaged in these kind of problems and solving these kind of problems. So I came back. I went to high school, went to college, and then I volunteered for a senator from Nebraska named Bob Kerry, who had worked with my dad on the anti-war movement after the Vietnam War. And
wait a minute, hold on a second. Is your father Allard Lowenstein?
Yeah.
We've known each other a long time. I have never put two and two together. My God, your father was such an amazing leader and did so many amazing things. I remember just growing up watching him and all the stuff he did and all the stuff he led on. You know, it's so funny. I never put the two together. Wow.
Yeah, so that's how I sort of got started. You know, a bit maybe about what my dad did, and the sort of culture in our family was that you should go and sort of make some kind of a contribution in whatever form. So in any event, I did Bob Kerry from Nebraska, and then I went to law school, and I was working as a lawyer at a big law firm in Boston, and I went to a fundraiser for Senator Chris Dodd, who was raised money in Boston from time to time, and I was all dressed up in a very fancy sort of Hermes tie and whatnot, and I went over and I said hello to Senator Dodd. I was like, "Hi, Senator. I think you knew my dad back in the day," and he looks at me, takes it by like, "You're Al Lowenstein's son?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Your father would be ashamed of you." And I was like, "Whoa." A hard thing for me to hear at the time. So, I sort of laughed it off, but I remember walking back to my office and going like, just thinking like, what am I doing? I was a corporate lawyer in Boston. I really wasn't happy, and I just felt like that was I needed to make a change, and that was the sort of push that got me out the door. Anyway, so I went and volunteered on John Kerry's presidential campaign, and then he lost, and I was a lawyer briefly. I had a kid, and then Kerry asked me to join his staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. First trip we took was to Iraq. And we staged to go into Iraq in Jordan. And I was in the control room with Dodd was with us on the trip. So I'm in the control room, which is where they stick all the senators and their staff. And we were drinking a glass of wine. Then Kerry went to bed. Dodd and I had several more glasses of wine. And I said, "Senator, you probably don't remember this, but you changed my life." And I told him the story. And he gave Dodd has a great big Irish belly laugh. And he goes, "Oh, Frank, I got to tell you, I don't remember that, but I'll tell you why I did it. Your dad was my hero growing up. He's the one who got me into politics, and I owed it all to him. And I finally was elected to Congress from Connecticut. And one day I get a call from your dad, and I was like, "Dad, I got to see you right now." And Dad was like, apparently I had taken a position that was insufficiently liberal for Al. So he shows up in my office and he looks at me, and Dad said, "I was wearing a three-piece suit." And your dad looks at me and he goes, "Look at you in your three-piece suit, Dad. If they made a six-piece suit, you'd probably be wearing that." And he's like, "Then your dad passed away, God rest his soul, and I thought I'd never have a chance to get him back. And then you showed up in front of me in that fancy tie." So he was like, "Payback's a bitch, man."
Wow, that is a really great story. That is really
so anyway, from there, I did Foreign Relations Committee with Kerry. That was really fascinating in the sense that, Hillary was the Secretary of State. She wasn't really she was doing some public diplomacy really as much as anything else. She wasn't really rolling up her sleeves and going and trying to solve, really, really hard problems. So Kerry sort of raised his hand, and Obama sent him on a series of sort of trips we did Sudan 4 or 5 times. There was an independence vote there. We were in Pakistan and Afghanistan 5 or 6 times. We were in Syria 5 or 6 times, basically just doing off the grid diplomacy for Obama, where they had they had on arm's length. So if we did something good, great. If not, like, I don't know what the hell Kerry was doing, right? But you can imagine from our perspective, it was the most fun period. We travel all around the world.
How great. And doing real stuff, important stuff, amazing.
Yeah, it was some of those things. In some ways, it was really the most interesting work I've ever done, just because there were so many different problems we were trying to deal with, and we'd go from one to the next. And then when Kerry ultimately became a chief staff of the Foreign Relations Committee. And then when Kerry was Secretary of State, he asked me if I wanted to come and do Middle East peace for him. And so I did 4 years, the whole sort of Kerry term. I was the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And we had what may turn out to be the last, honestly, direct negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians on the contours of a final status agreement, 1967 lines and security and refugees in Jerusalem and all of the other stuff there. And really was a one of those be careful what you wish for moments. I remember the first day, Kerry and I Kerry left after like 2 weeks of trying to wrangle the parties together. And by the way, the fact that you have to pay the Palestinians to come to the negotiations is patently absurd. And the fact that the Israelis refused to do anything to help the process move along. Before we even got started, we were both like, what's going on here? These people are impossible. Anyway, so Kerry finally leaves, and I'm all walking to the airplane, right? So, United States of America, big blue plane, it's sort of 4th of July. And we're walking to the plane. There's funny pictures. The guy was taking photographs along the way. And I'm looking at him like, we're nowhere. Like, this shit is never going to work. And he's like, "Frank, I disagree. I think we're really close. And moreover, you're going to stay here and get us over the line." And I'm like, "You've got to be kidding me, dude. I'm getting on that plane." And he's like, "Frank, I'm the Secretary of State, and I order you to stay." So we go into this big press avail, and Kerry announces, "Oh, we're this close to getting the parties to agree to negotiations. And, my guy, Frank Blue, the envoy here, he's going to take it from here, and he'll be happy to answer any questions." So the press all come, scurrying around me. They're like, "What's going on?" And I'm like, "Okay, off the record." And they were like, the first thing I was like, "Yeah, we're nowhere near."
We're not that close.
On the record, we feel this is real. But anyways, I just remember vividly lying in my hotel room, the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, and being all alone. I had one admin person with me, and nobody in the State Department, the administration are very famous for having this giant bureaucracy that surrounds anything. I got to get 18 clearances. Sure. And I'm lying there all alone in my room, and nobody calls me. I call back to the State Department, and they're like, "Oh yeah, this kind of Kerry's thing, Frank. Good luck." And nobody called me for 2 weeks in a row, except for Kerry, who called me every day to say, "Hey, Frank, you got us over the hump yet?" But I just remember lying in my bed at night. This is my dream from the time I was 12 years old. This is all I ever wanted to do, was to have this opportunity to work on this issue, to have that kind of responsibility. And I just remember my heart jackrabbiting in my chest, ultimate sort of be careful what you wish for moment. And I knew I was in so far over my head. I knew everyone was lying to me. And I said to Kerry, if you don't know who the sucker is at the negotiating table, it's me. We would go around, and I just knew I was getting. But in any event, finally I got my arms around it. And then the negotiations were obviously very intense. Learned a lot about how that conflict's ultimately going to play out. But then we spent 3 years really after that managing the conflict, as we say, and sort of just understanding what's actually going on the ground and what you can try to do to move that thing forward. So it's really a fascinating experience. And I think at the end of it, I understood international affairs, diplomacy, U.S. power in a very different way than I had before. So it's really informed a lot of the stuff that I do now at APCO.
And you've done since, sure. The embassy wasn't helpful. The ambassador, the embassy staff.
The ambassador was a great guy. Dan Shapiro is his name, and he was very experienced. He really understood Israeli politics. Yeah, just really, I thought an incredible civil servant Dan was, and very knowledgeable. Sometimes we have ambassadors who don't know Israeli politics very well. Right. And that doesn't help. What you really
don't they alternate? The way I used to understand it, it used to be a career person, a non-career, they used to go back and forth. I don't know if they still do that, but I know that's how the ambassadorships used to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with both. Jim Cunningham was our ambassador. He was a career foreign service guy when we were during the Foreign Relations Committee era. But Shapiro, since then it's been political, folks, and it should be, honestly, because you need somebody who has the presidency here. But more than that, you need somebody who understands politics, right? This is a fundamentally political job. You need to be able to explain the information that Shapiro gave us that was really helpful. Was this is Bibi's politics behind the scenes, right? So he's saying this, but these are the guys who are really calling the shots, because Bibi's fundamental concern is always his own political survival. So having what Dan was especially good at was explaining, hey, here's what's really going on behind the scenes. Here's where Bibi's politics are around this. This is what you can. This is what he says. This is what he probably really means, given what we know about the political forces that are at play here. So he really played an invaluable role there, but he wasn't really involved in the negotiations part of it, at least at first. That was more something that Kerry and I were trying to pull together with we had experts from the State Department and whatnot, but we were really winging it. And the good part about that is we came with a new set of with a fresh perspective. Really focused on the security element, incredibly heavily. Had the whole Defense Department basically coming up with a security plan for Israel in the context of a two-state solution, and we did a lot on economic development in the West Bank, which is something that Kushner has certainly picked up on. And I saw all the different threads that needed to come together to make this work, but I also was just taken by how far away the parties really were from actually making a deal. And I'll just tell you very briefly, the last, when the negotiations fell apart, the very last night. So we had a 9-month negotiating period, right? And we were trying to extend. This was the very end of that period, and we were in negotiation with the Israelis on the one side, which was Tzipi Livni and Itzik Molho and Mike Herzog, who was ambassador to the U.S. subsequently, and then on the Palestinian side, you had the normal cast of characters over there. And we had a proposal on the table to extend the negotiations for another 6 months or whatever it was, and everybody wanted to get paid, by us to extend the negotiations. Again, the dynamic was all wrong. Why are we begging you to extend negotiations that are obviously in your self-interest, right? We're doing this for you. Why are we begging you? Anyway, so we were sitting around. There was the Mount Zion Hotel in Jerusalem, and we called it the Martin Indyk, who was my great friend and mentor. We called it the Last Supper for the two-state solution, right? Because we were there on the Mount Zion. Anyway, so we go around the room, and we have all these. And I introduced a proposal. Yeah, well, we have this idea. We can extend the negotiations, and when I was done. The Palestinian negotiator, Majid Farash, who's head of the Palestinian police, he stood up and he said, he had tears in his eyes. He looked at the Israelis. He goes, do you have any idea what's going on the other side of that border? Do you see us? Do you understand what we go through? Do you see us as human beings? Because we don't feel like you. And then Livni stood up, and she's very moderate on this stuff. And she said, my son goes off to reserve a service in the IDF every day, and I never know when he's coming home. Do you know what that's like? You know what it's like for Israelis to live with that kind of fear all the time. And I just remember I took all my carefully prescribed notes in our plan. I just threw it away. And I was like, That's what's actually going on here. These guys are so far away from actually understanding each other that the idea that they're going to work together to solve this problem is just it's just fundamentally, profoundly not going to work. So I think there's things we could have done differently. I certainly think that there's things the Israelis and the Palestinians could have done differently. But at the end of the day, we were just nowhere near an agreement, and I think we're a lot farther away from that today even than we were then. So I'm happy to get into that later if you're interested.
Yeah, I want to get back into it. How incredibly interesting. What a fascinating thing to do. I had the opportunity to work with Tzipi Livni when she was foreign minister and spent
Yeah.
a lot of time with her. As people may know, I think she's the first baby born in Israel after independence, as I recall the story, that her mother
Interesting.
was giving, I believe the story is her mother was giving birth literally as independence was happening. I think her parents were in prison, and were released. But when
Oh, I think
her,
her dad was Irgun, right? So
yes,
her
yes,
dad was a
yes.
member of one of the early. I'll tell you just very briefly. I saw Tippy last year at the Munich Security Conference, so almost exactly 1 year ago, and we were on a Middle East peace panel, and the moderator came in. It was supposed to be Trump's guys were supposed to be there, and the Israeli government has representatives, and neither one of them showed up. So the moderator comes up to me and Tippy, and he's like, "Hey guys, so the Trump guys haven't showed up, Frank. So I think maybe you could talk to the U.S. perspective. What you think Trump's going to do?" And then they turned to Tippy and like, "Well, Netanyahu's folks aren't here, so can you speak for Netanyahu?" We looked at each other like, we're not exactly the right people
That's
to
very
carry
funny.
that message forward, but whatever we can do to help.
Speaking about parents being proud of you, when her mom died, I was working for a not-for-profit, and they sent me a note I should send to her that just wasn't me, so I rewrote it as a child who has lost their parents and knowing how that feels. And I sent her a note uh, as one child who lost a parent to another child who's lost a parent. And I said to her, your parents would be so enormously proud of you. Then about 2 weeks later, I was in Israel and I was at the foreign ministry and I saw her and she comes up to me and you know what she's like. And she
Yeah.
just looks at me and she goes, "You made me cry." And I told a couple of people that story, including a couple of reporters, and they looked at me and goes, "That did not happen. There's no way." Anyway, we will get back to Israel. But hey, we could literally spin the globe and wherever it stops, put our finger and start talking about things. But let me do spin the globe and let me stop at a place that is in the news constantly this week, and that's Davos, Switzerland. As our listeners may know, the World Economic Forum is wrapping up in Davos today, and many of the world's leaders were there. But not only world leaders as far as politicians go, but world leaders as far as economic titans of the world were there as well. Frank, would you just take a moment because I think while you and I understand what's going on in Davos. I think a lot of people don't. Could you just explain a little bit what Davos is, what the World Economic Forum is about, and what's it intended to do?
Yeah, so it's really originally started as a gathering of the world's biggest business leaders and corporations came to address economic issues, and it's just heads of state began showing up, and now it's become just a giant confab where heads of state come and talk about the issues of the day. Corporations do their thing, but for the most part, it's now become a forum for whatever the issues of the day are to be aired out, discussed, debated. They've spent a lot of time, for instance, on things like climate change, which has intersections between business and diplomacy. And this year was really, I think, may go down in history, Richard. We may look back on this Davos as being perhaps the most significant Davos ever, in the sense that you may very well look back on this and say that was the day that the new world order that the United States and our allies set up after World War II came crashing to a halt. Mark Carney gave a speech where he effectively said that. And the fact that Donald Trump was there openly threatening to invade a NATO ally, right? That was the end of the rules-based order. If the United States does not wish any longer to comply with a set of rules that we set up because they advanced our interests, and I'm talking about the United Nations, right? There's the whole Bretton Woods Agreement, the IMF, the World Bank. There's the WTO, and then there was alliances like NATO. This was effectively the order we set up in order to address issues of collective concern to the world, to prevent wars, right? And to advance U.S. values, democracy, human rights. That was sort of the point. And it's been a linchpin of American foreign policy, ever since then. I taught a class during Trump's first term at Yale with John Kerry about American power in the 21st century. And a lot of it was about the threat to the New World Order, the threat to the established set of rules and principles that the Trump administration was posing. But still, it largely remained intact. I think Trump was constrained to some degree by the people he had around him then. But now I think it's very hard to make the case that anybody in NATO can rely on the United States to come to their defense, right? So I think or that the United Nations is going to have any real. Trump set up a board of peace. It's supposed to be like.
I want to get to that later because I find that really, really fascinating, the board of peace. But I mean, the New World Order, 1945 was a long time ago. And I guess it begs the question of what was wrong with the old world order, and is it just time to reevaluate everything? And isn't that what Donald Trump is doing? Isn't he just saying, you know what? To continue with his argument, the United States has been bailing out the world forever. And we saved Europe from the Nazis. We saved the world from all these catastrophes. We are the bank of the world, not the World Bank, but we are the bank to the world. And we give money everywhere. And I think the political reality in America, to a large degree, at least to his base, is that people are just tired of it. So what is wrong with the end of the old world order?
Well, the old world order, all it really is at some basic level is, do we as the international community agree on a common set of rules that we're all going to play by that serve our collective interests, right? And that's what the United Nations was set up to do. And the United States, I really would take exception to the notion the United States has bailed out, Europe. Sure, we did World War II, of course, and then the Marshall Plan. But after that, I'm hard pressed to see a lot of instances where the United States actually took on any great risk or any great cost in order to defend the Europeans or anybody else. Article 5 has never been invoked in NATO. So I think Trump's notion...
It has been invoked in NATO to support us after 9/11. The only time Article 5 was ever used was when NATO came to us to support the United States.
Right. Okay. So yes. But anyway, it's never been invoked in the sense of we had to go do anything for anybody else. They came to our assistance.
Right. And look, we did the Berlin airdrop. You could go through different things that we have done around the world, around Europe. But I obviously see your point.
Yeah. So fair enough. And the theme of the class that Kerry and I taught was, hey, look, this doesn't really work entirely any longer. Right. We need to replace some of these, processes that we set up. They don't really reflect, like the UN Security Council, it doesn't have India or Brazil on it. And, you got countries, England, France, Germany's left out of it. So there are arguments for, expanding the UN Security Council. So there was things you could reasonably do to adapt this sort of rules-based system to reflect the realities of the present day. But the notion of just having rules itself, that was always in the United States' interest, right? So if we wanted to amplify U.S. power around the world, we have people that believed in the United States, that believed in democracy, that believed in human rights, that believed in freedom, not to use an old George W. Bush term, right? But we had a whole big section of the world, starting with the Europeans, who were really willing to follow us. So the end result of that was our power was amplified. Our interests were advanced by this system. Trump has turned it on its head and somehow or other claimed that this was something that didn't do anything for us and cost us money. I don't really understand, other than our contributions to NATO, what he's talking about there. I see it as something that was manifestly in our self-interest. We set up these rules. We set up these alliances in order to advance our interests and our values on a global level, right? And so for Trump to come in and just light a match to all of that, I thought one of the most amazing interviews I've ever seen was one Jay Tapper did with Stephen Miller about 2 weeks ago. Really extraordinary stuff. And Miller just got up and said, we're not doing any of that stuff. International niceties. The world is about power. It always has been, and it always will be. The strong take what they can take. The weak take what they can get. Right. And that's really the mentality. So you take something like a Greenland. Right now, I'm an operations guy. That's what I always was like. Okay, so this policy, what does it actually mean? How do we implement that? What do we need to get other people to do? In effect, Trump had a no chance of operationalizing that Greenland idea. Right, invading Greenland. You can say, all right, sure, we invaded Greenland. what does that mean? We would occupy it then, but we can't annex it. You can't create a new territory out of Greenland like we did with, Puerto Rico or certainly not another state without the consent of Congress, which she was never going to get. So there was no realistic endgame there other than Trump trying to bully everybody into selling which Greenlanders didn't want Denmark to. So there was a 0% chance that was ever going to work. Right.
But what was his plan? What did he want out of it? So if it wasn't to annex it, because that was impossible, and the people around him get it,
No, I don't think they do.
His chief of staff, Wiles, she understands what's going on out there. What was the plan? What did they want? I mean, let's get into Greenland. What is the goal in Greenland? Is it really to stop the Chinese and the Russians who are supposedly off the coast doing whatever? Or is there some other plan here? What are we trying to accomplish?
Well, it's important to understand that we have full basing rights in Greenland under a 1951 treaty, or 1954. Right. So we can put whatever bases we want. We can send half the U.S. military there if we felt like it to defend Greenland. We can always invest in their minerals, right? But what Trump kept saying, and this is, I think, the real tip-off, he needed ownership. I can't defend it unless I have ownership. It's psychologically important to me. He said the thing about the Trump administration is they don't not only say the quiet part out loud, they say the quiet part loudly. Right? It's exactly. Like, I need this effectively for my ego. Honestly, I think, and there was a great New York Times piece. Peter Baker Susan Glazer wrote a book about Trump 1, and he wrote some stuff in the Times. So it's going. He's like, they asked Trump about Greenland, right? And he said, well, you look at it on the map. I'm a real estate guy. Look at it on the map. It's huge. That should be part. He just wanted America to look like it was twice as bigger on the map. And so any solution to the problems he was pointing to that didn't involve the Trump being able to say, hey, look, this giant place is part of America now, he wasn't interested in because he wasn't concerned about the substantive issues. There was many other ways that those could be addressed, and I believe will be addressed going forward. So in my mind, for him to essentially blow up NATO, right, by repeatedly making threats to invade a NATO ally, by throwing tariffs or threatening tariffs against our NATO allies who did nothing other than send a few observers to Greenland, that to me was destroying 75 years worth of work, creating a system that needed to be adapted, but needed to be, the basic structure needed to stay in place, in my opinion, in any event. He blew all of that up. The NATO alliance, which is the core of collective defense, basically called that entire thing for no reason other than that he wanted to be able to say, see, I got this big giant place on the map. It says USA on it now, which was never, ever going to happen. So I really do question, Richard, whether there are any grown-ups in that administration who are saying, hey, look, think this through. And we have a guy at APCO who worked for Trump in the first term. And, he put out a memo, for a really excellent memo. I thought it was like, we're not going to invade Greenland. That doesn't make any sense. Because back then they were looking at is how can we advance our interests here within the general confines of the rules of the road here, right? Trump just goes in, throws all the rules of the road out and without any sense of how that's actually going to help him achieve his goal. And there was none. There was no reasonable objective there other than maybe he could threaten and bully NATO into selling him. So the point is, like, we have a guy in the White House right now it's a different version of Trump than we saw before, just in the sense that you don't have even guys like Bolton, who's not my favorite guy, but like a reasonable human being, like, hey, let's at least think that now you have nobody around him other than enablers and facilitators, right? And so you get these crazy ideas that suddenly they're like, hey, Trump, you got to be you, man. We can't rein in, the brilliance of the man. We got to let him do his thing. And then you're just left with like, what a mess we've got. I thought it was incredibly embarrassing for the United States, right? For Trump to stand up in Davos, threaten tariffs on everybody. And then 3 hours later said, oh yeah, we worked out a deal on Greenland. And by the way, the deal they worked out on Greenland, which is, may not work, is still subject to the approval of Denmark and Greenland, is effectively that we would be the owners of the little pieces of land that our military bases were placed on, right? And there's precedent for that. But I mean, seriously, it's like, that side of Trump's like, we have ownership now. But it's honestly, it's like dealing with a small child sometimes. Like, okay, you can say you're an owner of, but the idea of the United States is acting that unpredictably, that whimsically, that irrationally, right? That we're flip-flopping that dramatically within a few hours. Is how can anybody in the world trust us or rely on us for anything now? And so that, back to your question, Richard, is I think the lasting message of Denmark, and Carney's speech in particular, where he said the New World Order is over. All the Europeans, none of them are joining the Board of Peace. None of them want to have anything to do with it.
Right.
And where do they go? They go to China. Because in a world without any rules, where it's just power politics, right, and self-interest, no values, China can offer a lot to these countries, right? If you just divorce the whole question of values from just what's in myself, and you might be able to rely on China, right, more than you can rely on the United States these days, because at least they're going to have the same policy tomorrow that they had yesterday. Whereas in the United States, nobody believes anything we say because the president changes his mind every 5 minutes.
Do you think NATO survives?
Yeah, I do, but in very much in a weakened form, right? In the sense that I think that the notion that anybody can rely on the United States to defend them. I mean, we'll see that they're working out a separate deal with Ukraine and U.S. security guarantees, because the NATO security guarantees aren't. They don't want Ukraine to join NATO. But in any event, I think that's what you're going to see is now the United States being willing, under Trump anyway, to provide that security umbrella. Places like Qatar, right? And the people that can pay for it, people that Trump likes. Right. So what you'll see, nobody's going to disband NATO, I don't think, but people will just start to look for other ways around NATO to address some of the concerns that NATO addressed through other means.
So look, Donald Trump will not be president forever, right? We just passed the 1 year mark. He has exactly 3 years to go. There will come a day where Trump is no longer president. Maybe he'll be a Democrat. Maybe it'll be Marco Rubio.
Inshallah.
Maybe it'll be. I'm sorry?
I said, inshallah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, really. Um, what happens when Trump leaves? What happens is Mark Carney's comment, is the Prime Minister's comment about what is happening today dealing with the Trump administration, or does America reassert itself in the world, in NATO? Um, does the rupture get remedied when there is a new president? Or is this
Yeah.
forever? Or have we now rolled the clock back to a more, I can't say even an isolationist president, because he's far from
No,
that.
no.
Far,
He's aggressively pursuing regime change all around the
yeah.
world. So, I think that the next president will come in, and we've seen cycles of this. If it's a Democrat anyway, they'll come in and they'll try to restore some of the ties that have been ruptured. Right? They'll try to be very reassuring. Oh, we still are completely committed to NATO, and we all want to work together. We want the United Nations to be a forum in any event to deal with transnational threats and common concerns like climate change and pandemics and that sort of thing. So we believe in this system, and we're all in a. The problem is, and this is structural for a democracy, is that you have a president for 4 years, maybe for 8 years. And so if you're a European now, if you're another country anywhere in the world relying on the United States, what this has really done is brought to the forefront the fact that the United States can't be relied on from one administration to the next, because the next guy may come in and change his mind. Now, it was always within a range, right? So that's why the system worked and NATO, because you never had anybody who was willing to just throw tariffs out, at every turn, who was willing to threaten to invade, other NATO allies and that kind of thing. So the ebb and flow of NATO and the U.S. coming to the New World Order obviously goes down under Republicans. Bush wasn't exactly a huge believer in the United Nations and all the rest of it. And then Obama comes in and he's like, he sends Hillary around and wants to restore United States standing in the world, and then we do that, and we did the Paris Climate Accords, the Iran nuclear agreement, all that stuff Kerry did in the second. And then Trump comes in and he sort of half blows all that stuff up all over again. And then Biden comes in and he's like, hey, we want to put it. And then Trump goes, it's at some point, it's a seesaw. And I think if you're talking about your nation's security, you need more reliability than that.
Before we move on to other countries and other hotspots, you've referenced tariffs twice now. I want to talk to you about that. Tariffs, usually tariffs are used as an economic tool, to balance things out, for example, between trade, between countries and costs and those type of things. But when I look at what Donald Trump is doing on tariffs, for example, raising the tariff on Brazilian coffee, right? Which hurts us probably more than it hurts anyone else. But he did it in a large part to help former President Bolsonaro in his dealings with Brazil and their legal system and whatnot. And you look at what he's attacking Canada on tariffs and Mexico on tariffs. And you just referenced what he did in Europe on tariffs, tying it. You disagreed with me on Greenland? Guess what? 20% tariff on you. It seems like tariffs have become the club, the sword that he is using to get his will. how does this go forward? What's the message to our friends? I mean, when you look around the world, if we're going to continually use economic tools to bring our friends to their knees, has this move forward? I think it was Carney who said something to the effect of, friends do not bully each other. Friends do not, try to diminish each other. How
Yeah.
does this work? How do tariffs work in this type of world order?
Well, I think they just have to be used like sanctions are used and other economic tools in our sort of arsenal judiciously, right? First of all, I think the Supreme Court may very well rule that Trump has wildly overstepped in terms of the EP authority he's been using to put these tariffs on. It's basically an emergency authority for the president. The ability to tax is in the Constitution on page 1 is Congress's job. Right now, presidents have always been effectively, given latitude to impose tariffs here and there, but the way Trump has wielded them, I think, is beyond what the Supreme Court is going to allow. So then they've already come out and said they'll find other ways to do it. But the thing about the tariffs you got to understand is the other country then puts tariffs back on us, right?
Right.
And what that does, first of all, it increases the cost of our goods overseas, which hurts our selling ability. But the tariffs also raise costs to the American consumer. It's effectively so. I don't think that I think Trump will have his wings clipped a bit on tariffs, but I think the real force that's going to rein in the tariffs is the fact that the countermeasures other countries can take and the deleterious impact that will have on the U.S. economy, especially heading in to midterm elections where the Republicans are in big trouble and affordability is the number one issue. So if Democrats can get out there and say, why is he throwing these tariffs out there? And the other thing is that he really doesn't usually follow through on the tariffs. They're a bullying tactic. And I think after a while, people are just going to be like, you're not raising tariffs. Okay, you raise tariffs on us, we're going to raise tariffs on you. And then Trump's like, okay, never mind. Right? I mean, you took the
What's it called? Taco?
Yeah.
Trump always chickens out. I think
I don't want Trump out there feeling like he's really got to follow through on all the crazy stuff he says, because otherwise people are like, but you look at what the Europeans were prepared to do on tariffs, right? They were prepared to levy a massive set of tariffs against the United States and some real protectionist policies there that would have been very damaging to U.S. companies. And once Trump saw that threat out there, that was part of the reason why he wanted to come down from the Greenland tree, right? Because those kind of tariffs were going to be very damaging to the United States. And Trump, he's a bully. This everybody understands it. The thing with the bully is you just got to stand up to him and say there's real world consequences for it. I'm not asking you nicely not to do this. I'm telling you, I'm going to hit you back twice as hard. It's what the Chinese did, and he backs down because it's not in the United States and it's not in the interest of the economy to really pursue these. So yeah, it's been very troubling the way he's wielded the tariff wand around. But I feel like there's some structural impediments to that hopefully will begin to rein him in over time.
But there are shifts in the market that are happening. For example, when you deal with soybean farmers in the middle section of the United States, like in Indiana, who sell a lot of goods to China. Well, guess what? Because of all of this, they're shifting their markets to Brazil. And someday, Trump, as we said, will not be president. But those markets aren't coming back to Indiana or Illinois or Missouri or whatnot. They are shifting to places like Brazil or Argentina or other places because China has other places they can get these goods from. So there is a hurt to the American people that is unrecoverable. But that story doesn't get out. That is not a story that gets discussed. But that is what tariffs really.
Yeah,
that's the implication to all of us.
Make sure to come back for part 2 of Richard Gordon's conversation with Frank Lowenstein on Unconventional Times. You've been listening to Unconventional Times with your host, Richard Gordon. Check out all of the episodes of Unconventional Times on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. To learn more about Richard Gordon and all of his unconventional conversations, head on over to unconventionaltimes.com. Thanks for listening.